As COVID surges, government leaders get a little tougher. Joining us on Columbus on the Record this week, Joseph Mas of the Ohio Hispanic Coalition, Joe Ingles, State House reporter for Ohio Public Radio, and Clarence Mingo, former Franklin County auditor. The fall COVID surge we feared has arrived with no sign that it will subside anytime soon. At week's end, Ohio was seeing nearly 9,000 cases a day. Hospitals and their intensive care units were starting to reach capacity. Red counties with very high rates of COVID, they grew in number, and for the first time, the state map has a purple county. Franklin County now has severe exposure and spread. Governor DeWine issued a curfew, closing bars and restaurants after 10 o'clock and urging everyone to stay home. Columbus and Franklin County officials issued a stay-at-home advisory.
But we're calling on people to take personal responsibility and to hold ourselves accountable. We're not asking police to enforce proactively, and there's no financial penalty, but there are consequences. If people don't follow these recommendations, more people will be infected, more people will be hospitalized, and more people will die.
Joe Mas, is what the governor and what the mayor are doing enough?
No, of course it's not enough, but it does show at least some level of leadership in saying this is the right thing to do, which is, of course, what we have not been hearing at the federal level at all. So it's good. But if I can add something to that also, Mike, I've noticed that where it works, where the safeguards seem to work are, for example, in office in state buildings where the masks are required and social distancing is enforced. But where it isn't, out in public on the street, that's where it falls through the cracks.
Yeah. Clarence Mingo, the governor mentioned, I think there's some evidence of this, is that people are wearing masks, at least in the urban areas. Rural areas may not be as much compliance, but people are wearing masks when they go out to the store, when they go to the office. It's they let their guard down when they have their friends over. And even if it's a group of only maybe a half dozen or 10 people, that's where the spread is occurring right now, and government really can't control that. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think there's been an argument sometimes used for political purposes that individuals have to prove themselves responsible, and it's not the place of government to issue mandates. And to the extent that that argument has strong credibility, it's certainly applicable in this instance where we as individuals making decisions behind closed doors have to do what's right and follow the highest and best guidelines. Each time I hear the word mask, I always think about Dr. Amy Acton and her original advice that her original counsel, if you will, that if we did not be careful and mask up as required, we would see 6,000 to 8,000 cases per day. Here we are, late November, 6,000 to 8,000 cases per day. So individual responsibility certainly is a mandate here.
Joe Ingles, the governor has been preaching that personal responsibility, wear a mask, stay apart, wash your hands, don't get together in large groups for weeks now. And the cases continue to just spike. There's no other way to describe it than a real surge. Is there any point where he's going to have to say we have to take stronger measures more than just this curfew, which is largely symbolic? Not very many businesses are affected by this. The bars were having to stop selling booze at 10 o'clock anyway, and they just have to kick people out at 10 now rather than 11. So this is still largely a symbolic gesture by the governor. What are the chances that if these cases still continue to grow, that he's going to have to really issue a shutdown order?
Well, there is always a chance, Mike, but I think the thing that we need to remember here is that Governor DeWine is trying hard not to do that. That's not what he wants to do. He's been very clear about it. He is telling people to wear a mask constantly. I mean, I've never seen, you could listen to his news conference and he probably says wear a mask 24 times, right? But the thing is, people are not doing it. Some people don't believe that it's a real issue. They don't believe COVID is real. They believe it's manufactured. They don't understand how it spreads so easy. A million problems out there in the way that people perceive this, and it doesn't help when Governor DeWine is doing those things in public, but we also see other elected leaders who are not. And they are sowing seeds of doubt on this. And I think that's something that everyone looks at and says, well, if they're not going to do it, why should I?
Joe Mas, no, there are orders in place and there are penalties for not complying. And the governor, a couple of weeks ago, he created this new unit through the Bureau of Workers' Compensation to look at businesses to make sure they were making their employees and their customers wear masks. The governor said this week that he saw 90% compliance with this unit, but that means that 10% were not complying.
Yeah.
But we didn't hear that those 10% were penalized. Does he have to get tougher on that 10%, or maybe it's 20% that are not following these guidelines as they're supposed to?
That's right, because it's a serious matter, and I think that it must be enforced. Now, I have not, as an attorney, I have not run into any cases, either my office or anybody else that I run into, of people who have been sanctioned or charged or fighting it back or anything like that. So I don't know to what extent they might be. But Mike, we're at a curious intersection. As you well know, there is a bill pending in the General Assembly to try to take the power of shutting businesses down away from the Department of Health. And then at the same time, those same legislators that are advancing the bill are resisting the wearing of masks.
Yeah.
So what they want is for businesses to stay open, but they're not showing the leadership as to how to keep those businesses open. So it's crazy.
Yeah. Clarence, one thing that keeps striking me is the governor has said many times that the data is showing that some of the spread, the new spread, is coming from weddings. And he asked folks, the new order says you can't dance at a wedding. You can't go up to the bar at a wedding. You got to stay at your table. Tables have to be 6 feet apart, just like in a restaurant. But early on, he said you can't have a wedding reception or you have to limit it to 10 people. He hasn't done that this time. If weddings are causing the spread, why not get tougher on that one segment of the economy? Yeah, people would be affected, but it's not like shutting down all bars and restaurants.
Yeah, I think, Mike, we continue to hear a lot about enforcement and what's practical and what isn't. I think, well, the one thing we learned from the spring early in the pandemic is that government mandates have their limits. I do believe Mike DeWine has shown a tremendous amount of courage in leading through this crisis. But at some point, and at some point could be tomorrow, next week, or next month, at some point, if this continues, we will have to assume a posture similar to what we assumed in the spring, which is very broad-based stay-at-home orders to ensure the safety and welfare of the general public. And I believe that most Ohioans on some level appreciate the nature of that, given the data that's coming out right now about the virus and its spread here in Franklin County and otherwise across the state.
Joe Ingles, of course, the reason why he's not doing it is he wants to keep the economy going. There are many, many people who would lose their jobs. Probably many businesses would go out of business permanently were he to shut down bars and restaurants. And we don't want to go back to that. We don't want to see these folks suffer economically. But balancing public health and public safety was what the governor is trying to do. Do you see schools being shut down anytime soon, Joe? Is there any talk of that? Some school districts are going part-time, some are full-time, like Catholic schools and private schools are going classroom every day.
Right. So far, he's leaving most of those decisions to individual school districts. And we're seeing at the college level, we're seeing some of the colleges say, hey, we're going remote for the rest of the semester. We're not going to bring the students back on campus. I think, we are seeing some movement there. Some schools are deciding not to have in-person classes at this point. But I don't know that the governor's going to step in on that. I think what this comes down to is that there are people who are looking at this as, hey, we've got to wear a mask, we've got to social distance for all of us, for all of our good. And then there are people who are looking at it as, can you make me? Can I legally get by with it? And that's where the real tug is right there.
Mm-hmm. All right. To that point, as the Governor DeWine's curfew was going into effect, his fellow Republicans in the legislature were passing bills that would curb his authority to issue public health orders. The toughest bill would ban the Ohio Department of Health from issuing wide-ranging stay-at-home orders. It would prevent the state from ordering quarantines of people who are not sick or not directly exposed to a disease. Supporters say the legislative branch needs a role in these wide-ranging health orders.
a lot of the things that the governor's done are out of good intentions. But for goodness sakes, for crying out loud, it's 8.5 months later. 8.5 months. And this chamber has been parked on the side. We have been stiff-armed, however you want to say it, but we have not been engaged at all.
This bill would make Ohio slow to respond to a crisis. It would take tools away from this governor or future governors. It would put the lives of Ohioans in jeopardy. This bill is a disaster.
Governor DeWine has promised to veto. Whether or not the veto could be overridden remains to be seen. Clarence Mingo, do the lawmakers have a point? Should they have more of a say in this? Has DeWine not been as forthcoming and as cooperative with lawmakers as he could have been? Could he have avoided this?
I don't believe so. I think Mike DeWine has been perfectly traditional in his approach to managing this crisis. Look, Ohio has a chief executive officer. That officer is called the governor, who has the power to make decisions that are not aligned with the power of the Ohio legislature. So I think, the governor is on point, as he has been, in exercising his authority on behalf of Ohioans. The real challenge here, Mike, is the political nature of the pandemic and whether or not we wear a mask and how we live through this pandemic. If you are Republican and aligned with President Trump, you see the pandemic one way. If you are not aligned with President Trump and perhaps Republican or Democrat, you see the pandemic another. I think the governor is just taking the highest and best approach, listening to the experts and following that advice on behalf of Ohioans. And I'm not sure that General Assembly is in a real position to comment and to lead to the same extent the governor is as the state's chief executive officer.
Joe Ingles, do lawmakers really want to say in these policies, or they just want to prevent the governor from locking the state down?
Both. I think they want both. I think the thing is that they have a pox in their own house in a way, Mike, because they're fighting among themselves about wearing a mask and social distancing. This week we saw a resolution that was brought forward by Democrats that would have said that every leader in the Ohio House would have had to wear a mask on the floor of the House to protect the people around them. And that was defeated. It was defeated. And so the thing is that, it's hard to lead on an issue if you're not going to get out in front and be an example on an issue. And that's where they are right now. They're trying to, say, well, Mike DeWine isn't leading the right way, but what are they doing to lead? That's the question.
Joe Mas, a legal question for you. Right now, I think they need 3/5 majority in the House and the Senate to override the governor's veto. The Senate is right there on this bill. The House, I think, is 2 votes short, but there are some votes that weren't cast on this latest round. If it were to get overridden, would the governor have a constitutional claim here to bring to the state Supreme Court saying, this is the job of the executive and the legislature does not have any role in this?
Separation of powers. Yes, I do think that the governor has not only an argument, but a good argument to advance before the courts in the event that this were to happen. And I think that the courts would be sympathetic to that argument. I think that the General Assembly, and Clarence touched on this a second ago, I think that the General Assembly is not suited to be able to respond quickly enough to the health demands of the society. So as a consequence of that, it falls on the chief executive to be able to advance it quickly.
Yeah, Clarence, that's what the governor mentioned. He used examples of, say, there was a train tanker that leaked and a dangerous chemical or biological agent was released into the air, and he wouldn't be able to act that quickly if this law was in place, because it says it only applies to folks who show symptoms or who have been exposed to someone who is sick. Are they not paying attention? Because we've heard over and over and over again that asymptomatic people can spread COVID. You don't have to have symptoms to be contagious.
Yeah, I think the lack of perspective emanating from the General Assembly starts at the White House. I think, if President Trump back in March had simply acknowledged this virus for, the illness that it is, with the severity that we're now living with, had he simply acknowledged that and demonstrated leadership by simply wearing a mask, following the advice of leading experts at the CDC and other medical institutions, we would not be having this conversation about Ohio's legislature and their opinion about it. We would likely all be aligned. What you're seeing is the consequence of presidential leadership that did not take this seriously, and the impact on other leaders who are aligned with his point of view on it. And it's been deadly and significantly consequential. And we need a better path going forward, starting at the White House, as to how we live with this. Otherwise, we're in trouble beyond the politics.
Speaking of politics, from the White House, President Trump issued a tweet this week which said, "Who will be running for governor of the great state of Ohio? It will be hotly contested." My guess is he wasn't talking about the Democrat who'll be running against Governor DeWine, but a possible Republican challenger. Word is that tweet was issued right after Fox News ran a clip of Mike DeWine calling Joe Biden the president-elect. Joe Ingles, what was Governor DeWine's reaction to that, or did he just brush it off as he does always?
He pretty much brushed it off like he does always. But we've heard, in recent days, there have been names that have circulated out there. One of them, Congressman Jim Jordan. One of them, former Congressman Jim Renacci, who ran for senator in a failed bid 2 years ago. So we've seen, some of these people who could possibly be running against DeWine in a primary. As for DeWine, he's trying to say, hey, you know what? I'm really focused on just getting through the coronavirus, running the government here and keeping things going. He's really not paying a lot of attention to that right now.
Clarence Mingo, Mike DeWine has been trying really hard to stay off of Donald Trump's radar. And this one was relatively minor as far as a rebuke. He didn't give him a nickname, for instance, or he didn't say somebody run against them or liberate Ohio or anything like that. This was a pretty mild little flick of the wrist, I guess you'd call it, right?
Yeah, you could certainly call it that. But it's also a lesson in the following, that bowing down to, the politics of intimidation does not pay. There is very little you can do to remain aligned with President Trump. The slightest slight is significantly consequential in terms of how the president behaves. So the best thing Mike DeWine should continue to do is to show authentic and sincere leadership. Ohioans appreciate that. And I think in terms of a primary on the Republican side, one may very well materialize, but the governor is widely supported, and he is widely applauded for simply doing the right thing, independent of Republican and conservative politics.
All right, our last topic. While lawmakers are busy trying to curb the governor's powers and passing bills naming the state's official butterfly and the state's official fossil, there was no action on legislation to undo a controversial law that led to the state's largest bribery scandal. Lawmakers promised to repeal and replace House Bill 6, the nuclear bailout law. That's the measure at the center of the indictment of former House Speaker Larry Householder and 4 others. But so far, lawmakers continue to just study the issue. Opponents of the bailout are putting pressure on state reps and senators. They put up a billboard and produced this ad.
When you leave, don't forget to remember, don't forget to remember me. When you leave, don't forget to remember.
We're gonna go back and we're gonna rip it out.
Don't forget to remember. Remember me.
Joe Ingles, we'll get to more of the action in a moment. Meanwhile, the FBI this week raided the house of the head of the state agency that regulates utilities. The company at the center of the scandal disclosed a questionable $4 million payment to a firm tied to an unnamed state official involved in energy regulation. And then the Public Utilities Commission Chairman Sam Randazzo resigned. Now, Joe Ingles, all of the action, a lot of action in this story, in this case, is happening outside of the State House. What is the status of the repeal effort?
Well, the repeal effort is still in limbo. And I think it's been complicated by the fact that a lot of the people who are involved in this scandal, if you want to call it, they're lawmakers who have been returned by voters to the State House. Former House Speaker Larry Householder was reelected. There was no voter mandate to get rid of House Bill 6. And that complicates the situation. And now you're seeing, people come out and say, different groups come out and say, you've got to get rid of it. Some lawmakers are pushing for it. But without a strong mandate, that's really kind of hurting the energy to get it done.
Joe Moss, did Democrats miss something? Because they didn't make a huge deal out of it. Maybe it just got lost in the whole Trump circus and all these other stories. But yeah. I didn't see a whole lot of Democrats really holding Republicans accountable for this bill during the past election. And Republicans might say, look, voters don't care.
Yeah, no, I think what happened is it got lost in the larger narrative concerning the election with Trump. Or perhaps more accurately, the election against Trump. But Joe said something that was really interesting, and I anytime I'm given an opportunity, I want to mention it, and that is that the legislators are not seeing a pushback because some of these guys get reelected. The reason they get reelected is because of gerrymandering, okay? And the reason that you don't get the pushback and it is because the people that are sending them there have a reason to send them there, but they're exclusive. These are safe districts. If they weren't, perhaps we'd see a different type of pushback.
And the timing of this case, it was in July when it first broke, which meant that the primary was passed, and there was no way for a Republican challenger to challenge a sitting state rep or state senator, and Democrats who didn't have a shot at that district couldn't run because the deadline had long passed, the primary had long passed. So you have a point there, Joe. Clarence Mingo, Sam Randazzo, FBI agents raid his condo early in the morning, lug out boxes. Not a good look. Then First Energy, the electric company, says that there may have been an inappropriate payment to a state official directly involved in regulating the utilities. And the next day, Sam Randazzo quits. It's not a good look for the regulation side of utilities in Ohio.
It isn't, Mike. It's a terrible look, and Ohioans at this hour have reason to have less confidence in how government works at the legislative and executive level. When I say executive, not for reasons that's stemming to Governor DeWine, but this image in totality about what is happening at the national level. You turn the newspaper, then you look at what's happening at the state level, and you just see all manner of dysfunction. And you see rebellion. You see rebellion and the suspension of common sense followed by criminal activity. And it's deeply concerning. I don't know if Sam Randazzo is guilty or innocent of things he may or may not be accused of. What I do know is that a strong effort has to be undertaken by Republicans to demonstrate integrity in government and the ability to self-regulate our own in those situations where we know things have occurred that do not reflect well on our oaths of office or the charge of leadership we've been given.
Joe Ingles, one last thing, about a minute left. Lame duck session continues after the Thanksgiving holiday. Might lawmakers do some kind of a partial repeal on this and at least get it off the plate for 2022?
They could, but they have so many things that they want to do during that time. We'll just have to wait and see how that turns out. One thing we have hanging over us right now is COVID. Yeah. So how much chance are they going to have to do anything with that circulating? Are people going to get sick and not be able to do it?
Yeah, you can see lawmakers saying we have to stay home, but there are a lot of bills out there that they have put off until this lame duck session, which is always very busy. But the pandemic, like everything else, is interfering with it. Let's get to our off-the-record final parting shots. Clarence Mingo, you go first.
Hoping for a better 2021, optimistic that Joe Biden will lead from the center and bring Americans together.
What are the chances, Clarence, of that? You putting money on that?
I think much of it depends on Republicans in the Senate and how they message interest in wanting to be better and demonstrate oneness as a democracy.
Right. Joe Mas.
Mike, I just read in the Columbus Dispatch that Franklin County had 75% turnout among registered voters. If we could model that and even improve on it, man, that's okay.
Yeah, 75%. And turnout was heavy everywhere, both Republicans and Democrats, which is a lesson for all of us.
Yes.
Joe Ingles, your final thought.
Black Friday's coming up, Christmas shopping, and one thing that we know is that a lot of people are going to do online shopping, but I think that the local mom and pop stores are saying a lot of them are hurting. They're afraid they're not going to make it, so you might want to throw some dollars there when you're shelling out money.
Yes, another reason why the governor and the mayor is so reluctant to order any kind of shutdown, because those folks, Christmas season, they're depending on that, especially this year. My off-the-record comment, all of this investigation into voter fraud, I hope, proves to everybody that voter fraud it happens, but it's extremely rare, and maybe we can put this issue aside for future elections as we try to make it easier for folks to vote. That'll do it for this week. Check us out online, WOSU.org, also on Twitter and on Facebook. So for our crew and for our panel, I'm Mike Thompson. Have a great holiday and stay safe.